All right. Well, welcome everyone to our Kenneth Roemer Lecture on World Affairs. My name is Denise Battles, for those of you whom I've not met, and I'm very privileged to serve as SUNY Geneseo's president. I'd like to start by offering a land acknowledgement, which is designed as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose historic territory we reside on. In particular, Geneseo resides on the homeland of the Seneca Nation of Indians and Tonawanda Seneca Nation. This acknowledgement is intended as a respectful recognition of a painful history and is particularly important in light of our educational mission and our community commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Every year, we come together to honor the life of Kenneth Roemer, for whom this lecture series is dedicated. His longstanding interest in global issues inspired his brother, the late Spencer J. Roemer, who was an emeritus director of admissions at Geneseo and member of the Geneseo Foundation Board of Directors, to endow this event. A longtime supporter of the college, Spencer Roemer, who we also recognize and honor this afternoon, left a legacy that each year brings some of the world's leading foreign affairs experts, academics, and authors to the Geneseo campus. They include people like Georgina T. Wood, the first woman to serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Ghana; Vincent Ferraro, the Ruth Lawson Professor of International Politics at Mount Holyoke College; Cameron Munter, a former U.S. ambassador to Pakistan; Nazreen Gross, an authority on human rights in Afghanistan; and Manuela Peak, Professor of International Relations at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador, and Lowenstein Fellow in the Departments of Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies, and Political Science at Amherst College in the U.S. This afternoon, we will add one more to this select group. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Dr. Justin Barron, who is professor and chair of our Department of History, to introduce this year's Kenneth Roemer Lecture speaker. Justin.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm very honored to be the person to introduce our speaker. He's going to give a talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. So please be thinking of some opportunities to engage with Mr. Rozell. So Matthew Rozell was born and raised in Hudson Falls, New York. After high school, as you can gather from the screen behind me, he attended SUNY Geneseo, where he earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. He earned a master's degree in education and started teaching world history at his alma mater at Hudson Falls High School in 1987, and taught virtually every subject in the social studies department over the next 30 years. When he wasn't teaching, he was in the regular year, he was also offering summer archaeology field courses, but his real passion and interest was in the history of World War II. And this led him to create an oral history program at the high school that really made history come alive. Mr. Rozell and his students interviewed over the course of many years hundreds of veterans for the World War II Living History Project. And one of those projects, I'm sure he's going to speak about today, uncovered an old shoebox filled with photographs from the day that the 743rd Tank Battalion liberated 2,500 Jewish concentration camp victims from Magdeburg, Germany. And that discovery became the basis for his book, A Train Near Magdeburg, which is also in development for a film. This led him also to organize reunions for Holocaust survivors and the soldiers who liberated them, and he's facilitated at least 10 of those reunions over the years. For his extraordinary educational work, Mr. Rozell has been given many awards. I'm going to list a few of those here. He was a teacher fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2008. The Organization of American Historians, which is the main historical society for U.S. historians, gave him the History Teacher of the Year Award in 2010. He won the Founders Medal for Education from the Daughters of the American Revolution. The Board of Regents of the state of New York gave him the Louis E. Yavner Teacher Award for distinguished contributions for the teaching of the Holocaust. Upon his retirement from the classroom in 2017, he was honored with resolutions from the United States Congress, the New York State Senate and Assembly, the village of Hudson Falls, and the city of Glen Falls. The greater Glen Falls Jewish community recognized him as a righteous human being with a tree planting and a monument, which is in his hometown. Since his retirement, he's devoted his time to editing a series of oral history books on World War II called The Things Our Fathers Say, and he's already published 7 of those with a few more on the way. So please join me now in welcoming Mr. Rozell.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, President Battles, and thank you all for coming today. This is a great honor to be here at my alma mater, and I want to thank, first and foremost, my lovely wife, Laura, who's in the front row. We actually married at St. Mary's Church in 1989. She was a Long Island girl. I was from upstate New York, and we met here at SUNY Geneseo. And we did graduate in '83. My wife, who's always had a really good head on her shoulders, 2 days after we graduated, found a real teaching job in a real school district. And I had to go back for my education classes because I wasn't as serious as she was. I took a lot of history classes when I was here, though. And now I look back and I see that schedule full of history classes but no real clear direction as almost a blessing for becoming what I eventually became, and that was a history teacher. So I went back for my education degree after I actually graduated. And when I did my student teaching, I did my practicum at Geneseo High School under the tutelage of world history teacher Myra Herlihy, and her husband John was one of my supervising professors when I did my student teaching. And I give that couple a great deal of credit for putting me on the path to, the successful 30-year career that I did have in the classroom. And I also want to mention Dr. Wayne Mahood, who was a legend in the education department. He was a pioneer in social studies education. He was a Civil War historian. I credit him for putting me on the right track too, because I really needed some direction. When I came to Geneseo in 1979, my mother and I came out in May. We looked at the place. She needed a place to put me, a family friend. One of her best friend's daughters was graduating that May. I think she kind of combined the trip to come out. So I started here that September, and it was rough my first semester. I almost dropped out, but I didn't. I came back and I started to thrive in my second semester here. I was in a triple with some other students who weren't the best students, let's put it that way. That first semester, I was probably in the same category, to be honest with you. But when I came back, I started to find my footing. I had some great professors here in the history department and other departments, and I really had a great time. And I became part of the community. I was a chef at the Big Tree Inn for 7 years. I started out as a dishwasher, and Fred Robinson, the owner, I remember sitting down with him my first day on the job. And I have a lot of Big Tree friends who are here in the audience, by the way, co-workers. The boss sat down at the table with a lowly student, and I didn't know what to say to the guy. We had meals. He would feed us before the shift started. And I was making small talk, and I said, "So I guess you own the place, huh?" And Fred just, I don't even think he looked at me. He just said, "I don't know if I own it or it owns me." And that was the way he was. And he taught me a lot in the kitchen. And I almost went that direction. But no, I had to do something with my history degree. And I got my education degree. My dad taught world history in Glens Falls High, which is across the river. We lived in Hudson Falls. And when I left town in '79, he asked me what my plans were. I wasn't sure. But I told him, I don't know, Dad, but I'm leaving Hudson Falls, and I don't think I'm coming back. So there. I think I broke his heart. But 7 years later, I had my degrees, and I was back living in his garage, and I was driving his hand-me-down car up to my old high school on the opposite side of the desk. So I did talk to some students, and I see a lot of you guys are in the audience. Thanks for coming back. I hope I don't repeat myself too much. I had a great career, but some really important things happened. And, you know, I'd like to talk to education students or people who are thinking about going into teaching, or my fellow teachers, my colleagues, my, you know, professors, because this is what it's all about. And the things that happened to me in the classroom, I really can't explain the story I'm about to tell you, but it's had a pretty profound impact on, I don't want to be melodramatic, but thousands of lives all over the world. And it still continues to unfold. So one of the things I did was I started an oral history project shortly after I began, actually it was about 10 years after I started. But the way that started was when you're teaching world history, which is 8,000 years of civilization in two years, and New York State students know there's a Regents exam at the end, and your administrators want to see results, and you're kind of pressured to get through a lot of material really fast. But I would kind of push back against that when I got to be about this time of the year, in the springtime. I would stop and I would ask the students, how many of you had a grandparent who was in World War II or had something to do with the war? You know, when it was time to actually study that topic. And every single hand in the classroom would go up. They all had grandparents who had something to do with World War II, and in some cases, their own parents, okay? So this is the late 80s, early 90s. Sometimes two hands would go up. So a spark went off in my head, and I created a 2-page survey for them to bring home to their grandparents, and I wanted the student to ask questions like, where were you, what was your rank, what branch of the service, what did you see? And some of these guys, it was only a 2-page thing, you know, they wrote really cryptic short responses, or they wrote things that really challenged me as a teacher. And I remember one survey in particular that came back, and a really, you know, unsteady hand, he's probably in his 70s or 80s by then, guy who survived the Battle of the Bulge and many other things, he just wrote back, I don't know how you could make the young people today understand what it was like to go through a nightmare like a World War II. And I was like, okay. But he was right. I wasn't there. I was born 15 years after the war ended. So I began to invite these gentlemen, usually men, into the classroom, and they would speak to my students. And I would do my homework first. For example, if they were a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, I would know what happened. I would know some questions to ask, and the kids would chime in. But they were riveted for the most part. Their attention was honed right in, because here is living, breathing history unfolding, not out of their textbook, but right in front of their eyes. So we began to actually record these interviews with the veterans' permission. And again, this is totally off curriculum. It's off topic. It's not going to be on the Regents, right? But I would have the students type up the transcriptions, and now the internet is born, quote unquote, late 90s. We would put the interviews up on our school website, again, with the veterans' permission. And I had an oral history project that was born, and I was using technology, which was, you know, the big push back then in the schools. I mean, your administrators wanted to see you do this stuff, so they let me have this little project. And for the second half of my career, I was allowed to teach an oral history World War II elective. And it became World War II and the Holocaust for the reasons I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so here's a picture of me. Again, I think it's mid-90s. What are you laughing at? That's my wife's laughing in the front row. But yeah, I invited these guys, and it's just like one thing would grow out of another. I started, other teachers, students wanted to come in, so we took over the library a couple of times, and I did symposiums, and they would come in for an afternoon, and these are veterans of the Pacific War. Art Laporte, Jimmy Butterfield with the aviator glasses, he was blinded on Okinawa in May of 1945. And Walt Hammer, who was wounded on Iwo Jima. Art was on Iwo Jima too. So we did a seminar on Iwo Jima, and the kids ate it up. It was great. So I did a lot of these things, and I got away with it. Meaning other teachers would release their students to come in and listen to these veterans. And that's kind of hard to get a math teacher to do, Math and science were the hardest ones to bust out of that nut. This is the last year that I taught in my classroom, 2017, my last group of kids. And you can see World War II related newspaper front page headlines took over the back of my classroom. And great kids. So to make a long story short, we did about 200 oral histories, and I would send these kids, especially the bottom row here, I would send them into the community. I would assign them to a veteran. They would conduct an interview. In some cases, get really close to this older person. And they did good work. And they created history in a way because they preserved these veteran stories. But I'm here to tell you about one particular story. Okay, so that's my oral history project, 200 plus interviews. I'm actually working on my 9th oral history book right now. But this took on a life of its own. The interview with, his name was Carol Walsh, Red Walsh. He was a retired New York State Supreme Court Justice, no dummy, 80 years old, in a rocking chair in his daughter's house in Hudson Falls, New York. I had his son in class at the time, and his son-in-law actually, we shared a daycare provider for our children. He said, my father-in-law's coming to town. You want to talk to him? He was a tank commander in World War II. Red lived in Johnstown. He was originally from Johnstown, New York. So we live about an hour away. So he came up for the summer. I went over there in July of 2001. He told me, we had a great conversation for 2 hours, and he's rocking away. He's laughing like crazy. We recorded the interview, and right at the end of the interview, just as I was about to conclude it, turn the camera off, his daughter said, Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozell about that train? And he didn't. He had not told me what would go on to change the lives of thousands of people after he told me this short story. And when I say short, it was a couple of minutes. He said, well, no, I didn't tell him that story, but it was a nice, beautiful April day, a day like today. We were going like crazy. We had fought from the beaches of Normandy. We had crossed over into Germany in October of 1944. First city to be taken, German city of Aachen. And then they were sucker punched by the Battle of the Bulge. They were sent down into Belgium for that horrible, horrible fight. They survived it. They crossed the Rhine River on March 25th, 1945, and there were 2 soldiers in this story, actually 2 or 3 very important people in my life. So Red Walsh is on the left, and the guy with the pipe is George Gross. George Gross, Red Walsh had just graduated from Albany Law School when he was called up. George Gross was actually working in a parachute factory. He had a military deferment. He was in California because he worked in that important industry. But he said, no, I'm going over the fight. So they both wound up in the 743rd Tank Battalion, which was a light tank battalion. These tanks were not heavily armored. Their job was to do a lot of scouting, and the infantry would follow up on foot. They were attached to the 30th Infantry Division, which landed. The 743rd actually did come in on D-Day, but their unit came in a couple of weeks later. And these two guys just didn't get along. So before this photograph was taken, they fought a lot because Red was he hated the Army, and he was a jokester, and he knew they had a job to do, but his attitude was, let's get it on and get it over with. Whereas George was much more by the book, more of a patriotic type thing. So they didn't hit it off, they fought. And you have to remember, they're inside of one tank together at the time. Well, that changed once they, spent all this time freezing and fighting together. They both won battlefield commissions by the time they crossed over into Germany. So they both commanded their own tanks, each with a crew of about 5 guys. So, where this story takes off, he said, I didn't tell you, but on April 13th, Major Benjamin came up to me and Grossi, he called him Grossi, he said, you two, Tank 12 and Tank 13, we have to go find out what's going on with this train that's down in this valley. They're on their way to fight a major battle at the city of Magdeburg on the Elbe River. What is this train doing stopped on the tracks with civilians milling around outside of it? We got to find out what's going on because they're in harm's way. So the major pulled up in the Jeep. He had a camera with him. And I speculate the Jeep stopped, and the major stood up and snapped his photograph. And it's a very dramatic photograph because these are Holocaust victims who are simultaneously at that moment realizing that they have just been saved. They were from the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen. They had actually been on the tracks, traveling probably 80 or 100 miles for the previous 6 days and 7 nights. In fact, today's April 6th. Today's the day that this transport of 2,500 human beings left Bergen-Belsen. There were 3 trains that left Bergen-Belsen on that day. Of course, the Allied soldiers know nothing about this, but this is the liberation photograph that is now, I don't know if you've ever seen it before, but if you haven't, you will someday. It's been shared over a million times on social media. And it caught the attention of a lot of important people in my life. But that little girl in the front, I asked my audiences, what do you think's going through her head? There's obviously a feeling of joy with some of these survivors coming up the hill. But that little girl looks pretty terrified to me. And I speculate it's because Red's tank and George's tank are clanking up right behind his Jeep. And she's kind of freaked out about seeing these monsters come up. Well, Red did not really even think to put this in his 2-hour-long conversation with me. He was only there for 1 hour. George, on the other hand, he said, you want to get a hold of Gross because his tank stayed with these people overnight. Walsh had to go back with the commander because, again, they're on their way to this major battle. Now, the next day, a unit of the 30th Infantry Division showed up. Those were the infantry guys attached to these tanks. And they led these people out of harm's way to a recently captured Luftwaffe proving ground, air base, about 15 minutes away, that had hospitals. They had barracks. They had military doctors and nurses there who were ordered to look after these people. And 6 weeks later, all these areas where these people were transferred over to the Russians because of the Yalta Agreement. So I got a hold of George Gross, and he gave me permission. There's Major Benjamin's after-action report photograph in the National Archives. But he gave me permission to put the rest of the photographs that he took because his wife gave him a Brownie camera on the internet. So I put them on our school website with his beautiful, touching narrative. He was an English literature professor. I may have neglected to mention that, but he wrote a beautiful narrative. And there was one girl in particular he got really close to because she was his translator. She was a Polish girl from Krakow who was actually teaching a lot of the young children in this exchange camp in Bergen-Belsen. She spoke 7 languages. Her name was Gina Rappaport. After the war, well, after my story broke, they reconnected again. So it was pretty exciting. So I put these photographs and the testimony on our school website, which I told the students in here before. Our school website only got about 20, 25 hits a day. You know, it was no big thing. But unbeknownst to me, the Bergen-Belsen Memorial in Germany, at the site of the former concentration camp today, they were aware of our school website. And people, survivors, child survivors, would go to them because they wanted to know more about their time in Bergen-Belsen or what happened to my parents in Bergen-Belsen, whatever. And anyone who was liberated on this train, they would send them a link to my website where all these photographs were and where the names of their liberators were. So I got an email from the woman on in the screen here. Her name is Lexi Kesten, and she had been a 7-year-old girl on the train. She was a grandmother in Australia. I was actually giving my students the test that day, and I, peeked at my email while their backs were turned, and I started to cry because this woman said she saw photographs of the day of her liberation, and she fell out of her seat. She called Dr. Gross in California. Dr. Gross, at the time, was watching the TV news, and it was upsetting him greatly, whatever was on the nightly news. You know how it is. He was yelling at his TV set, and that's how angry he was with the news. And this woman called, and she started to cry on the phone when he identified himself. She said, did you have anything to do with a train in 1945 that was liberated by American soldiers? I said, yeah, I was there. And they hooked up. So that was in March of 2006. It was 4 years after I put the photographs up. And the next month, I heard from a professor, a physics professor at Brooklyn College, who had been a 6-year-old Polish boy on the train. Lexi was a Dutch girl. I heard from a 5-year-old, former 5-year-old doctor in London who had been a Hungarian boy on the train. And I heard from a retired airline executive who had been a German Jew. We remembered Kristallnacht. We remembered the night of broken glass. The family escaped to the Netherlands, where most of the Jews in hiding in the Netherlands were eventually caught, found out. And within the space of literally a couple of months, I heard from these other people. It's like, why now? Who knows? But I got this idea in my head, I'm going to do a reunion. I'm going to invite these guys to Hudson Falls High School when Red Walsh is in town. I mean, one lives in New Jersey, one lives in New York City. Come on. Lexi couldn't come, but the doctor from London came. So the three of them got together. They spoke at the high school in 2007, and they got to meet him again. And you know what he said to him? He said, long time no see. Long time no see. But he was just floored with what these people had done with their lives. Not that he was a slacker in his life. But here I am. I'm a history teacher, and we did this great thing, and it was in front of the student body. So the kids got to witness his testimony. And the really wild part, there's a lot of wild parts to this story. And the story's not over, by the way. Within the last month, I've heard from 2 more people who had been children on this train. Within the last month here. I had a friend who worked at the Associated Press. He came up and he did a story, and he kind of warned the school secretaries that they might be getting some phone calls if this story took off, and it did. It went viral before being viral was a thing. The next morning, it was pouring rain. We said goodbye to the folks, and it was a Saturday morning now. I went to buy a new computer. So I went to the local Staples, and the pushy salesman was trying to get me to buy a brand new monitor, which I didn't need. So he turned the monitor on, and this was what was on the screen. That's my classroom. So we were the lead story on Yahoo News, back when Yahoo News was a thing. Almost pre-Google, not quite, but I was like, oh my goodness. We heard from 60 more survivors that weekend. The school service shut down because so many people all over the world were trying to download the photographs. And these survivors came from all over the world. This news story went everywhere. I also heard from Frank Towers, who was a liberating soldier, and Frank was the guy who took these people out of harm's way, and he got them to that German military base and hospital. And Frank was an administrator at the University of Florida at Gainesville, retired now, so he had some time on his hands. He made it his mission to track down as many of these people as he could. So between me, a woman who was the daughter of a survivor in Israel, and Frank, over the next X amount of years, we found 275 people. And it got me thinking about doing a book on the topic. We did 3 reunions at our high school. 2007 was the first. 2009, ABC World News came up and named us their Persons of the Week. A teacher, a high school teacher, was their Person of the Week. It was pretty incredible to see that. And we actually got to watch that story. They came up from New York. It was a 3-day reunion at our high school, again in front of students. And the student body was so good and so loving. And we got to watch the story at our final banquet that Friday night. We wound up having 11 other reunions. Frank was also the head of the 30th Infantry Division Veterans of World War II group. So he would invite the survivors. Every year they'd have an annual reunion, usually down south. And I was invited to all of them. They made me an honorary member. We did one reunion in Israel, and it was attended by at least 55 child survivors who wanted to meet Frank. And they paid for him to go to Israel and stay for 2 weeks. He met the Israeli IDF chief of staff. He was definitely treated like a king over there. And I wrote the book. I knew I had to tell the story. So I actually published this my last year of teaching. I did bring some copies if anybody's interested over there, but that's my reason for being here is not to sell books, it's to tell you this story. But I brought them in case you're interested. And I've been working with the director for several years now on the PBS documentary. We got the green light from PBS, but we're still working on some of the funding because they don't pay for you to do it. We've raised about $100K. It's a donor-funded model with a 503c. So I'm actually going to Germany next week, actually Saturday, right? I'll be at Bergen-Belsen on Monday. I've been there. I was there in 2013, which I'm going to show you in some of the slides. But I'll be at the actual liberation site on the anniversary of the liberation, which is kind of cool because I've never been there. So, academically speaking, some of the things I had to think about in the book. These questions came to me as I began to study because one of the persons who noticed my story that weekend when it went viral was the head of the education program at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which I know many of you have been to, and if you haven't, you have to go there. The Teacher Fellow program was set up to help educators learn how to teach this vast subject called the Holocaust, specifically helping to educate not just students, but other educators. So you're almost an educator of an educator. And I learned a lot when I was in that program, and they were really excited to find these photographs for their collection. How many people were murdered in the Holocaust? Well, the standard answer you get is 6 million. But what does 6 million look like, right? 6 million Jews, by the way. About another 11 million total. Who's responsible for this crime? The biggest crime in the history of the world. How do you kill 6 million people? Did Hitler pull the trigger? I don't think he pulled the trigger on one person in his life, outside of his combat experience in First World War, nobody corporal. But how were the people on this train a snapshot of what happened during the Holocaust? we had Hungarian, most of them were Hungarian survivors, you know? Where does this fit into the big picture of the Holocaust? The Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. We had Polish Jews on this train. In the West, they turned their attention in May 1940 to France, right? The Netherlands, the Low Countries, Norway. Not too many Dutch Jews survived the war. And there were a lot of Dutch Jews, I shouldn't say a lot, but several Dutch Jews who were child survivors on this train. So there was a story here that kind of began to take shape after I began to talk to some of these survivors and get their own personal testimonies. Can I make people care today about what happened nearly 3 generations ago? In other words, who cares? Why does it matter? Why is it important to listen to those who were the first witnesses of what happens when these stories are no longer with us? That's a really good question. And once people have absorbed these stories, it's not a Hollywood film that you're just sitting here and, you know, digesting and getting emotional about and then going to eat your dinner afterwards. It's like, what's the real reason I'm writing this book? Do we have a moral responsibility to act, quote unquote, responsibly? And as I was telling the students in the history class before I came in here, geez, all we have to do is look at what's going on in the world today. In Ukraine, these atrocities that are coming to light. This is what human beings are doing to other human beings. So an event that happened 77 years ago, 85 years ago, that's yesterday. That's nothing. But so many people don't know anything about it, or worse, they think they know everything about it and they know nothing. Is there such a thing as being a witness if you yourself were not there? And I think that's a really important question. So this article came out in 2013. I think it was 2013. And it was written by a New York Times reporter who was actually embedded in the Holocaust Memorial Museum for a term of time. And he was there studying some of the research that they had been doing over the previous decade to previous to 2013. The Holocaust just got even more shocking. You know, I'll ask the question, how many concentration camps or how many Nazi-related centers devoted to genocide were there? And this is the answer, and this answer is an ongoing evolutionary thing. Almost 43,000. That's a 9-year-old answer, by the way. Okay, so when you take into the whole scope of this thing called the Holocaust, as I was mentioning to Dr. Somerville when he came in today, the thing about history and the thing about any discipline that you're excited to teach about, the more you study that discipline, the more you realize, or that topic, the more you realize you don't know. And I say, when you're studying something as complicated and involved as the Holocaust, it's like walking into a room with 12 doors, opening one door, going into another room that has 12 more doors. This is what it's like to study in depth these topics. I studied at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem for 3 weeks. I went on a 3-week authentic site tour of the death camps in Europe, starting with Bergen-Belsen. And I spent a lot of time at the Holocaust Museum in DC. So I felt it was important to add something to the conversation. I went to Belsen. This is what Belsen looked like when I was there. Here's the map, and this is from a book when I started teaching, a Time Life series. The red dots are quote-unquote concentration camps of the Third Reich. I had my students count them once. There's about 300 dots. And the larger the dot, the more people were murdered there. And of course, your major quote-unquote extermination centers were in the east, Auschwitz, etc. That's why the dots are bigger there. But Bergen-Belsen I circled because you can also see it was quite large. By the time the Americans came and liberate the train on the 13th, this is what the Allied picture was on April 18th, actually. Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British armored on the 15th. The Soviet Red Army was closing in on the other direction. So when the British liberated Belsen, this is a monument survivors put up about 20 years later, 1965. This is what Belsen looks like today. When I toured it, this is a model of the camp with German historian here at Bergen-Belsen. Those are my fellow teachers. The model of the camp that doesn't exist. This is actually individual grave sites because it became a displaced persons camp after the war because, as you may know from your studies, a lot of countries didn't want these Jews after the war. They didn't want them before the war. That's why they were stuck in Europe. And some of my survivor friends who had been in Bergen-Belsen as prisoners wound up back in Bergen-Belsen as displaced persons, and this is where some of them died afterwards. One of my little girls, she was 11 at the liberation time. She's still alive. She lives in Toronto. She was in Bergen-Belsen until 1950, trying to get out of the country. Trying to get to a country, I should say. So if you go there today, it's a very peaceful, serene place. And that's our group walking through the beautiful Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Why is it beautiful? It was a contradiction, really. This is what it looked like when the British soldiers walked in. And I don't show these, I use these pictures very judiciously in the classroom. I think you really need to with young people, so I don't dwell on these photographs. But this is what happened. And this is what the British soldiers, young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, walked into without a clue on April 15th. 800 people died the day the camp gates were thrown open, by the Germans themselves, by the way. They surrendered the camp, but there's nothing there today. This may be the exchange camp that I was telling you about. Again, a beautiful stroll. Well, let's bring it back to 1945, the springtime. That's what the British soldiers found themselves with. I'm walking through the woods here where there was a barracks complex. That's like a slit trench latrine. Going through the woods now, there's a person who's sat down and died right next to it. Anybody know who she is? Her name's Margot. That's her sister Ann. They died here. That's a marker where their bodies most definitely are not. Nobody knows where these two poor girls are. They died about 3 weeks of starvation, typhus before liberation. The Frank sisters and the mother and the father, they'd been deported from Holland to Auschwitz, but they wound up back, the women wound up back here in Belsen for the horrible winter of 1944-45, where they got sick and they died. And they're buried in one of these. And this says, "Here lies 800 dead." Because that's what, you see these pictures, you may have seen them before, it's most likely Bergen-Belsen. If you see a man in a bulldozer, he's pushing them to the bodies, that's Bergen-Belsen. Mass graves everywhere, 1,000 dead. Typhus killed a lot. This Hungarian artist was actually liberated on the train. Is a typhus victim. It's lice-borne disease. Carried a lot of people away. The reason Belsen is so pretty today is because the British burned it in May of 45 to stop the spread of typhus. So there's nothing there except their memorial. And I'm going to see this guy next week. His name is Bernd Horstman. He actually came over to our high school for the symposium in 2009 with survivors. A lot of them knew him because he's the custodian of the Book of Names at Bergen-Belsen. His job, a German historian, is to reconstruct the records of every human being who went through Bergen-Belsen. And so far, he's compiled a book of about 50,000 names, which has been published, but there are 120,000 people who went through Bergen-Belsen. Not all of them died there, but his job is to reconstruct it. I'll see him next week. So the little dot, little blue dot, is where the American train was liberated. The destination camp was a camp called Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. This is the map from the Bergen-Belsen Memorial. It shows the route of these. There were 3 transports that left. The first one left on today's date in 1945. That was the lucky one. That was liberated on the 13th by the Americans. The second train actually made it to Theresienstadt, and the third train was liberated by the Russians across the Elbe River 2 weeks later. And this is part of the story that's in the book. Why the evacuation transports and why Theresienstadt? It was actually Himmler's idea. It was the end of the war. Everyone sees the handwriting on the wall. Hitler saw it too, but he wanted to take the Germans down with him. But Himmler's looking for a way out, and these people were called exchange Jews. They had certificates or papers that were indicated that they were of some value to a foreign country. So they were going to be used as bargaining chips. But by the time the next week unfolded, things just fell apart. Totally fell apart. And Steve Barry, he saw the article, and he actually got together with Judge Walsh down in Florida. Very emotional gathering. He wrote this letter to Walsh, in which he thanked him for being his liberator. And Walsh wrote him back. This is his handwriting. This letter is now in the Holocaust Memorial Museum, by the way. I told them about it, and the director herself said, I got to have that letter. And in the letter, Walsh states, thank you for that most unusual, interesting, and clever card that you sent. Steve would send cards to all the liberators. He was a funny guy, too. And they were funny cards, like birthday cards or Easter cards or whatever. I shall keep it with my memoirs and see to it that it is passed down to my descendants. And he says, I have some comments, and I'll just summarize it. He says, you are always thanking us, calling us your saviors, your liberators. He said, no, we were just doing our job as American soldiers. What I want to express here is the fact that the world didn't do anything. When you needed us, the world turned their back. So I was just doing my job. I was doing what the world should have done from the outset. And that was a pretty profound statement, but that was not an uncommon reaction from a lot of our American GIs who encountered this trauma. So at our high school, this is Frank Towers. He was the soldier tasked with bringing the survivors out of harm's way, and that's Ariella Rojic. She's my 11-year-old girl. She was actually born the same year my mom was. So she's like almost a surrogate mom. But she actually sees herself in one of the photographs. And she was 5 years in Bergen-Belsen after the liberation. Frank went to Israel, 500 people in this huge university auditorium. Imagine sitting in a room and there's a guy on the stage talking, and he's the reason for your existence. Because that's what it felt like for a lot of these survivors and their families. So it was quite emotional. My friend Leslie lived in Toronto as well. That's him as a 17-year-old. And that's him with his quote-unquote revenge, his granddaughter. Great man. And Lily, who found me, and she came from Israel, Tel Aviv, to Lake George, New York, and we're on board a ship, and she wanted to meet me. She was okay with meeting her liberators. In fact, she did. She met Frank and stuff. But she wanted to meet me, and that meant a lot to me. And I went to Israel. I visited her a few times. She was an orphan. She was 4 years old. Her mother died in Belsen. Her father was killed in I think, Warsaw. She was Polish. But she didn't look Jewish, this little girl. But the thing she remembered about Belsen, and as a 4-year-old, what do you remember, right? She remembered the women in the camp, after her mother died, cutting her hair because it was full of lice. That's what she remembered. And she was taken by another woman under, the women of the camp took care of her. And she wound up in Israel on in an orphanage. But she had a wonderful adoptive mother and father, and she grew up very happy. And she was a Tai Chi master with a sword and everything. And she was a dancer. She was just an incredible human being. And to have something to do with her life was very moving for me. So, I mean, you get to the point where, you know, I'm going to wrap this up here, but I'm sitting in my classroom. You get to the point where it's 4 years have gone by. I haven't heard from any more soldiers because it came to the point where people were finding me. I wasn't finding them. And the phone rang in my classroom. Now, the school district put a phone with a direct outside line in my own classroom because I was getting these calls from all over the world for a long time. But the phone stopped ringing, and you know, I'd be calling up my banker from the classroom on breaks and stuff. But they left the phone in the room, but it rang. I think I had a study hall, and it was this guy, and he said, "Matt Rozell, God bless you, God bless you. I've been trying to find you forever." His name is Walter Gantz. Walter was at that, when the Americans took over this German hospital, Walter was the guy, he was a medic, he was a combat medic. He took care of these people. And he and his fellow medics there were really traumatized by what they went through. They were there for 6 weeks. These soldiers, Walter was only on the scene for 1 hour, right? He had people dying in his arms. He was very attached to one 15-year-old Hungarian girl who was skinny. You know, he got to know them, and she died in his arms, and he carried her down to the morgue tent. And he said, "Matt, when we would get together for reunions, the guys in my outfit who were there with us, we never talked about Hillersleben. We couldn't talk about Hillersleben." He lived in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is not too far away. Okay, so this guy, I'm sure you recall a few years ago in October, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This fellow was just pulling into his, I think it was before services, there was like a study group. And the gunman was just walking out after shooting up his friends. He was in the parking lot, Judas Salmon. And his training, he was a former Israeli paratrooper, you know, back in the day. He just stayed put, and he survived it. Well, the Washington Post did an article, and they write some good stories sometimes, and this particular reporter went in great detail and depth, and he mentioned, it was, a lot of the articles that appeared were kind of sensationalistic, Holocaust survivor cheats death twice, that kind of thing. Well, this story told about how he was liberated as a boy on a train by American soldiers. There are not too many trains liberated by American soldiers. So I dug a little deeper, and sure enough, he was on the train. We got a hold of him, and he was feted at the State of the Union address. It was actually his birthday, and Congress saying happy birthday to him. I got a hold of his daughter after an internet search, and we arranged for Walter and Judah to get together. So I'm going to end my story with this clip. We are working on the documentary. We filmed this, I think, about 2 years ago. So this is a trailer for our upcoming film.
A long time ago, over 70 years. It's a lifetime. Sadly, you know, at times your memories become dim, But there are certain events that will stay with the person all their lifetime.
I remember that the train stopped in the middle of the forest, and everybody panicked. Everybody felt that this place was going to come and kill us all. And sure enough, we hear a run of a tank, and then the tank opened, and a soldier popped out, and my father yelled Americans.
The response to seeing that star on the green painted tank and Jeep is one of unbridled joy for those survivors who were not too young to understand what it meant. It meant liberation. It meant that they were now safe.
Everybody, Fred, Stephen was saved.
I never dreamt that this would happen someday.
Happy, thanks to,
But life
thanks
is...
to a couple of great gentlemen.
My buddy Walter, he died in November that year. We did this in April. And a week after, we went down to film that at the hotel in Scranton. I heard from another survivor in Brooklyn, and I was doing a talk similar to this in New Jersey at a community college, and that guy came up. So he got to hook up with another person here, and it was just great. And he was a former high school coach, and everybody called him Coach. Everybody loved him in that town. And when he died, his family put a copy of the book in the coffin with him. I found that out. Well, they told me afterwards. And, he said, "Matt, I've read your book 10 times. And he wasn't doing it, he said, because I'm in the book, because he is. He's like chapter 14. He said, I wanted to learn more about what happened. I wanted to see where this thing that shaped my life, how did it happen? Where do I fit into the big picture? So really, when I did write the book, I was writing it for the soldiers and for the survivors, because they had this trauma inflicted upon them, but then they saw the goodness of humanity in the form of these American soldiers and this medic. So yeah, it's been a pretty emotional trip. I'm going back next month. We finally got permission, the green light. And I'm really excited because I'm going to meet German school kids where the train actually was liberated. The site is right behind their high school. They never knew anything about it. Their teachers didn't tell them about it. Actually, one teacher did, and that's how they started their own little project there. And they helped get a memorial place at the liberation site. So I'm really excited to meet these German school kids because it's almost like coming full circle in a way. This started out as an educational history project with high school kids, and it's gone it's hard to really put your finger on. That's what I'm trying to do in the book, is make sense of everything. But it just keeps unfolding, which is a beautiful thing. Yeah, so when we were collecting these oral histories, I said, look, kids, I got to do something. I can't just throw these in my filing cabinet. They're all archived at the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs, New York, but I also did these books thematically, and yeah, that's where we're at today. But yeah, it's been an incredible journey from, you know, my first Saturday night at the bottom of the Rathskeller drinking beer near Ontario Hall, which is my dormitory, to where I'm at today, you know, and kind of cementing this story in the history, contextualizing it with this thing called the Holocaust. And, you know, why keep talking about it? You know, why another Holocaust documentary? Aren't there enough, quote unquote? Well, I beg to differ, because unfortunately, from the satellite images we see on the streets outside of Kiev right now, or Kyiv, it's still happening. You know, human beings are capable of horrible, horrible things, but they're also capable of great acts of humanity and kindness, and that's kind of what I try to bring together with this story. So at that point, I'd just like to say thank you, and I'm sure you might have a couple of questions which I can try to answer. So thank you. Yes. Yes. How did all these different nationalities from all over Europe, these persecuted Jews, wind up on this one train? For example, 6-year-old Polish boys, 13-year-old German boys and girls, and the Hungarian families that were on this train. The answer to the question is, the last ones, they arrived at various states in the history of Bergen-Belsen. I think the earliest ones arrived in 43, when Hungary was invaded by the Germans in 44 in March. 43,000 Jews perished between May and July. 43,000 in Auschwitz. Very few Hungarian Jews survived the German invasion of Hungary. Hungary switched sides, hence the German vengeance. But some miraculously wound up in other camps, but eventually wound up in Bergen-Belsen because they were trying to establish what they called an exchange camp for certain Jews who were, quote unquote, had certificates or papers indicating another government was interested in their well-being, so they wound up in this place called the exchange camp in Bergen-Belsen. So when the horror was unfolding in the spring of 1945 with masses of humanity on the road, don't forget, you got the Red Army coming this way, you have people being death marched out of these German killing centers to other places, shot along the road. A lot of these people were being transported to Bergen-Belsen because that seemed to be the farthest out of the way of the Allied Army's path. And they didn't exactly know what to do with them. But the exchange Jews had a quote-unquote value, and they wound up on these 3 transports on Himmler's orders. But there was so much confusion, there was so much military activity, and there was so much just mass movement of human beings that they kind of got lost in the shuffle. But as you'll learn in the book, a lot of the survivor testimony from the people who were liberated on that train, they were liberated about noontime on April 13th. 2 hours before, a mobile SS death squad showed up. They were on bicycles, They had machine guns strapped on their backs. They set up a machine gun nest, and they ordered the boys and the men off the train. And they wouldn't get out, so the SS took off, and the Americans showed up about an hour later. And these SS guys wound up getting captured eventually. But to answer your question, the Holocaust is a vastly complex topic. There's a book by Professor Yehuda Bauer, one of the main scholars of the Holocaust. He lives in Israel, actually studied with them a bit at Yad Vashem. It's called Jews for Sale, with a question mark, and he discusses it in great detail. I learned a lot from his book, but in my book, I tried to put that into perspective for these children now, adults and grandparents, who are wondering the same thing on the train. It started at the top, and it was Himmler, but it just fell apart because of all the confusion. Yes?
What consideration has been given to attaching these stories and testimonials to artificial intelligence? So instead of reading about them and reading these stories, you can actually see a hologram. I know 60 Minutes just did a recent story about that. I think Kevin Magdeburg, if I'm getting your name correct, who does a lot of Holocaust.
Well, no one's contacted me yet. Maybe they will after the documentary comes out. A lot of people in Holocaust educational circuits or higher education, like we were thinking the Shoah Foundation might be involved a lot with that. Obviously, it takes some money. A lot of my survivors, though, are still with us, so they would be good candidates to do this. So. Yeah, I mean, funding is one of the key things, right? One of the key initiatives. And we have a lot of that testimony ourselves. And unfortunately, the liberators are almost all gone now, unfortunately. Yeah, education, there's a huge need for this, and it keeps evolving. And I don't think we can discount using any of these tools in the future, right? But again, it takes somebody who has to take the initiative and run with it, so to speak. I mean, the funding's there. There's a lot of money out there. It's just a matter of connecting the dots.
Well, I also think that it's, for Matt, on behalf of his school district, they supported this whole journey that Matt did, which was, I would say, a little bit unusual. We're having oral history classes
Yeah.
or an elective in school.
Yes.
And then when they continued with these reunions, that last one went for 3 days, a whole immersion in the school.
Yeah.
And all staff, teachers, the community supported that. So like our own children and these other students who are now adults also witnessed what Matt was trying to also teach, you know, the generation that we have coming through now. And again, it's all about being a witness, whatever is happening.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes. My books are on ebook, audio, hardcover, paperback, whatever form you would like. And they tell important stories, and I was mentioning this to the students. Because in many cases, the children of these soldiers who went off to war, and nurses, my aunt was a nurse, she's in volume 4 in Italy, they didn't know their own parents' stories. I mean, if you read some of the reviews for these books, a lot of them are from the second generation who grew up in a household where there was love, or maybe there wasn't love, but there was screaming at night, there was traumatic days in the calendar when you didn't disturb dad on this day, and they never knew anything about their father's own personal journey and story. But when they read these books, these guys, in many cases, they're bearing their souls for the first time in their life, in many cases to a teenager that they're not even related to, who has shown an interest in this story. And some of them got emotional. Some would cry. I can remember one girl saying, "Mr. Rozell, what if my veteran cries?" Well, you let them cry, and then you you get on with the story. You know, if you want to skip that part, fine. Turn the camera off, fine. But let them process. So I'll get a lot of reviews, or I'll get emails, and they're pretty they're thanking me for helping to explain what went on in their household when they were growing up. Because this trauma, in many cases, it doesn't skip the second generation. It's passed down to the second generation. And, you know, there's been studies on this with Holocaust survivors and stuff. And I don't want to stereotype these family situations because every family is different, but what the project turned out to be, and I guess this is the message for the future teachers in this room, it was a catharsis, a personal catharsis. It was a bonding between old and young, and ultimately it's a national catharsis. And I'm thinking about our Vietnam veterans. You know, the stereotype is, you know, what they came back to, but it's true what they came back to. There weren't any marching bands for them. How many Vietnam veterans bottled up what happened to them? And it's not just Vietnam, right? Not at all. So I think it's important for people to talk about these things. But again, in training my young students to be oral historians, they, you know, you have to kind of go with the situation, but you also have to ultimately realize that you're doing something really good for the greater well-being of humanity in general. You know, we preserve the stories of what happened to the American soldier on the battlefield. Well, this is a story of what happened to a human being and how they reacted to it, how they grew from it, or how they suffered terribly from it. There's lessons here for everybody. And, you know, you get started on the topic of the Holocaust and, you know, you can just look at your world around you today. Are things better than they were 10 years ago? It's like, geez, that's when I was teaching this stuff. What's going on? How come this stuff is still going on, right? It's because education never ends. It never ends. And just when you think you've done your job, something else happens. So that's the whole message I have for teachers. I've been retired for almost 5 years now, and I hate that word because I'm still teaching. I'm still teaching in hopefully what you heard today and the books that I try to get out, because these are the things that we did, and I'm not going to let them stay buried in my filing cabinet. And for the most part, human beings respond to this. Hi.
Normally have a loud voice. My parents were both children under the age of 10 in Nazi-occupied Holland, and they immigrated to this country and had 4 children. And one of the stories that I grew up with were stories about the American GIs, Hershey chocolate bars and gum. And I think that really shaped my own experience. It shaped my interest in the world, and I went on to study education and be a social studies history teacher. And it's an honor to be here today because I'm the current Dean of Education here at SUNY Geneseo. So I'm just honored to be here and listen to what you've shared, but also to recognize you as an alum and as a teacher. You've done a great service, and just really been amazing to be here today.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot.
You're welcome.
After my student teaching, my first experience where you had to, you know, go on videotape, and then you went in with the supervisor and he kind of critiqued you. Oh my God, it was a disaster. I was taking a nap on the green in front of Sturgis, and I was waiting for him to call me into the office, and he saw me out there. So he figured I probably went out and had a few beers the night before, which I probably did. And he put the videotape in, you know, I'm shuffling, looking at the floor, not addressing the students, and he set me straight. That was Dr. Wayne Mahood. And he went on to become Matt Rozell champion #1. And I'm sorry he's passed away. I wish he was here today. But yeah, that was cool. But thank you very much for being here and listening to my story. There's more, by the way. I just keep this really short. I almost showed you this little clip. Those two guys, Steve Berry, the Holocaust survivor, and Judge Valls, when they met in Florida. It's a 15-minute audio clip, but it's got photographs, present day, of them meeting, and it's got photographs of 1945, and it's really funny. But it also has Walsh explaining how he really didn't like the mantle of being called a liberator. As he said, I don't care what you say, you're still my liberator. And it's funny. But that's the link to it if you're interested. It's on YouTube, I think. So anyway, yes, ma'am.
The little girl on the front of your book.
Yes.
Did she ever contact?
I've heard from many people who claim that that's their mother. When I say many, 2 or 3 who are pretty strong candidates. A lot of the Jewish people on this train were from Orthodox families. So there's a sizable contingent, for example, that live in Brooklyn, New York, or Israel. But I think it's a Hungarian girl dressed on the way the aunt or the mom is dressed in this photograph. And there's a couple of strong candidates, but I haven't boiled it down conclusively to actually who it is. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure that's an important part necessarily. I mean, it's cool when people can identify themselves in these photographs because there have been positive IDs. But the photograph does say it all. It does say it all. And I think there's a message here for everybody. But I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you.